that say, I'm going to bring our next storyteller, Elizabeth Gomez.
Does that work? No, it's not my shoes. I'm still taller than you. First of all, can you guys give a round of applause to everyone who's been up here already? It's been amazing. Okay. I hate Joni Mitchell. I do. And when I say that to people, people act like I punched their mother. I like music with strong beats and a soul. The kind of music that makes you imagine firm hands rolling your underwear off your hips as someone sticks their face in your treasure trove of pleasure points, while you pull their face into closer to your body to get the full pressure of it all. Joni Mitchell reminds me of a crazy night at a party where you finally get to bang the crush you've had for 4 years, but he can't get it up, so he runs to the bathroom to drunk cry. You lean your head against the door and you tell him it happens to everybody, knowing that that's not true. Then he screams and he says, it never happens to me, and so you both end up just feeling sad. And it occurs to me that maybe it's about the music you grow up with. My father was not a Joni Mitchell guy. He was a Ford Tops, Brenton Wood, Luther Vandross type of fella. My dad was a soldier, was a ruler of our house stereo. I looked forward to seeing him after long work stints or times in the field. He'd come home through the door in his BDUs, battle dress uniforms, with a stiff camouflage hat atop of his head. I'd run to the door with my arms open, and he'd pick me up, and I'd wrap my 3-year-old arms around his neck, and I'd inhale his smell. He smelled like America. A slightly musky stink of hard work and patriotism, sprinkled with the saltiness of knowing that this is as good as it was going to get. And I could still see him turning up into the crackling sounds of an old record, swaying to the music, and asking me if I liked it, while I sat on the couch watching him. My dad, by all accounts, was a real asshole. He was self-absorbed, troublesome, and a liar. But damn, he was cool. You knew when he was around because the moment he entered a room, you'd hear the wet slap of women's panties as they fell to the ground. He was a dark-skinned Puerto Rican man who stood over 6 feet tall. His hair was cut short on the sides and on the back, but on the top, he left just a little bit of shining waves that made you kind of swoon. His mustache was perfectly trimmed, so it would cover the upper lip, but exposed just enough of his bottom lip that it looked like he'd always say to you, "Come here, woman. Sit by the fire. Have some Cavassier." He wore custom-tailored leather jackets with his name embroidered on cursive on the inside pocket. His pants were perfectly tight, and he wore Chelsea boots. He had one perfect silver tooth right in the front of his smile. My mother, on the other hand, was a Korean immigrant and silent and angry most of the time. She was petite with a dewy pale skin. Her long, thick black hair fell straight to the center of her back. She parted it down the middle, an even heft on each side of her head. Eventually, she cut it short and burned it out with perms with L'Oreal hair dye. And eventually, she also tattooed her eyebrows, and they turned kind of green, and now she looks like a ghost. Her eyes were half moons with thin eyelashes set above a narrow nose and a full dark pink-colored mouth. And when she smiled, her lips peeled back to reveal a few jagged teeth, and the room instantly felt comforting. Despite her beauty, I saw her as really mean. My parents argued about money and how irresponsible my father was, other women, and his weed habit, which I didn't know about, but in retrospect, he wore leather jackets and had a silver tooth. I should have known. And I didn't really care what my dad ever did because he was hot and charming. And who cared what he did? And unfortunately, this is the kind of thinking that would lead me to giving blowjobs in the back of cars with men who would never publicly date me in 2 marriages. I'm just saying I'm a sucker for a good face. Think about that. The demise of my parents' marriage ultimately ended up being this crazy love story between my father and a woman that he loved since the 3rd grade. Her name was Barbara, a meteor shower I never saw coming that was going to hit my world. Barbara is her real name, by the way, because fuck her. While it was my father's choice to have an affair and leave our family, it was also Barbara's choice to call and harass my mother while Barbara was feeling insecure that her boyfriend might be sleeping with his wife. I thought a lot about my parents and their backgrounds while fingering through the records that my dad had left behind. Their drifters, Rolls Royce, Roger and Zapp. I'm not even sure how they ended up married to each other. On some level, I guess it made sense. My father was a macho man, someone who commanded your attention and craved it. My amma, Korean for mother, happily blended into the background, cooking his favorite foods, washing his clothes, agreeing to whatever he wanted without argument. She was so Korean. It was a perfect arrangement for my dad until it wasn't anymore, and he moved to Germany with his girlfriend. At 14 years old, I asked my mom why she wouldn't divorce her dad, especially because I hadn't seen him since I was 9. She was afraid of him and didn't want to lose her children. She was under the impression that in America, military men had power, and that no one would grant her custody since she couldn't speak English, nor did she have the support system that most people have in the States. And my father took advantage of this by letting her believe that this is true, avoiding paying child support and taking money from her. When I was 16, I was enjoying an afternoon with my friend Carmen, Amma, and Emo, who's also, that's auntie for Korean. And it was a rare day because my mom was a waitress at a Chinese restaurant because she's an immigrant. And she would work 12 hours every day for 6 days a week. And then on Sundays, she would work a 6-hour day. But on this one day, we happened to have the perfect day. And we were out to a Chinese restaurant. And after we had stepped out, I had walked by this man who yells out, "Elizabeth!" And when I turn around, my father was staring at us. My father who had been living in Germany. My father who I hadn't seen since, and barely spoke to in 7 years. My father, who I found out later, had been living just 10 minutes away from me for a whole month on assignment. And there he was, older, chubbier, and completely out of context in a tracksuit. Amma swiftly jumped into action, and she threw me in the car with Carmen and Emo, and she said, "Go. I come get you. You go." And as we drove off, I kept looking back at my mom as she started to yell at my father, and I noticed a woman off to the side. It happened so quickly, I couldn't get a good look, but I kept squinting my eyes, hoping that maybe I could get a mental photo before it was too late. Carmen turned to me and she asked me, "Was that your father?" I sat in the back seat and I sank down as Emo turned up Belle Biv DeVoe, trying to get as small as possible, my ears and my face burning with embarrassment because I wasn't sure what to say. Later that evening, my mother came to pick me up, and she didn't bother coming into Emo's. She drove us home in silence, and we sat in the driveway. The car was dark, the neighborhood was quiet, and I looked at the shadows on her face as she started to stare straight ahead. "Mom, what happened?" She turned towards me, and I could see it, a deep cut and dried blood across her left cheek. She trembled in her accent as she said, He hitting me. He bring that woman, and he hitting me." I thought it was odd that he had left a cut instead of a bruise, but then I remembered what my father must have been wearing at the time. He wore a heavy gold onyx ring for as long as I could remember. I don't know what the story was behind it, but I remember that when I would smart off to my mother, my father would flick the base of my neck with that ring. It would not only sting, but it was a surprising whack to the back of my head to remind me that he was my father. Polished and shiny on the outside, with a dark and ominous center in the middle. My stomach ached as my mother did her best to explain what happened. After confronting my father about his disappearance and betrayal, I'm proud to say that Amma went for Barbara, which prompted the smack from my father. I imagined my tiny framed 4-foot-something mother standing up to my gigantic 6-foot-something father. He was intimidating not only by size, but quick to temper and unafraid to start a fight. And Amma knew this, yet she probably stretched every muscle of her tiny little feet to stand up on her tiptoes to meet his anger straight on. And that image pleased me. I wanted to say to her that she was a total badass and cooler than he could ever be. And I tried to tell her that I was so proud of her for just standing up for herself. And I went to jump on the car and wave a rebel flag, yelling, "Don't fuck with my Amma!" But we didn't have that kind of relationship. I'd spent so many years admiring and loving my father when he was around that I forgot I had a mother. And after he left, I spent all my time pining for his return or hating him for never being there, that again, I let this woman fade into the background, the woman who took care of me, the woman who worked for me. Instead of leaning towards her to embrace her, to tell her that I loved her so, so much, and I was so lucky to have her, I just looked at her and said, "He's a jerk, Mom." My mother loved Peebo Bryson and Roberta Flack. Tonight, I celebrate my love with you. I can hear Ahmad's broken English trying to recall the lyrics as she would sing it from her room, when she thought no one was listening after 12 hours of waitressing. It's a terrible song, but I love it so much. And it makes me cry every time I hear it. Because even though it's a song about making love, it reminds me of heartache and illusions and loss, which is really the music I grew up with. Thank you.